Uh, I'm up here in theory, of course, to introduce Dr. Jim Simons. I'm not sure that I actually need to introduce him because I think he may be the single largest or single most important reason that many of you are here today. So without a lot more ado, Jim, I'm going to just turn it over to you and let you start. Jim is president of Renaissance, as everyone knows. He's also the 2006 Financial Engineer of the Year. Jim?
Well, I just found out the answer to a question that I'd wondered about since last week when I introduced a person that everybody knows, and I had all these things to say, and I decided, the hell with it. I'll just say, what can I say? Everybody knows him. Here he is. And then it occurred to me afterwards, maybe he was kind of annoyed not to get such a big introduction. But I wasn't. I know the answer to the question. I wasn't annoyed at the least. And now I figure Sir Michael Atiyeh probably wasn't so annoyed either, if he knows who Atiyeh is. Anyway, I am glad to be here in this cavernous room that goes on and on. I suppose people in the back can hear me. The title of this talk is, I believe, Mathematics, Common Sense, and Good Luck. Now, that was the title of the very first talk I gave once I took up this career. And I've given a number of talks with that title, and what they actually all had in common was that title. I found it's a very good title, and I decided to use it today because they insisted I give a title, so that's the title. I will attempt during the course of this to connect to some of those words the things that I have to say. In fact, I'm going to start off with that because I am a mathematician, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But sometimes mathematics is trumped by common sense, and I'll give a few examples of that. So you can have all these wonderful formulas and so on, but there's no real substitute for common sense, except, of course, for good luck. Which is a perfectly wonderful substitute for everything. There's nothing which you wouldn't rather have than good luck. I think luck is something that we underestimate, or we tend to underestimate, as a determinant of what happens in our lives. Everyone here has to have started off very lucky, either having been born in America, or at least born to parents who could give him or her a great upbringing and education and all the rest. Probably 80% or 90% of the people don't have that luxury, certainly at the time that many of us were born, that was the case. So we started with this big stroke of good luck, and I don't know how much it occurs to any of us that was just a plain stroke of good luck. Now, people have an interesting attitude towards luck themselves. If an individual fails at something, he will frequently attribute it to bad luck, and if he succeeds, he'll think, well, with brains and hard work. Whereas your competitor, if he fails, you'd say he was such a dummy, and if he succeeds, we'd say, well, he was really, really lucky. So, we have, luck affects everything. I was at a lunch yesterday, and we were talking with some people about the history of the computer industry, the microcomputer industry. And you may recall, some of you older folks, that there was an operating system called CP/M. I don't know who remembers CP/M, but when these I see some hands go. So microcomputers came up, and that was actually the most successful one, CP/M 86, and then IBM decided to come out with a personal computer, and they called this fellow, or tried to get in touch with this fellow, Gary Kildall. He's not in the room, is he? No, he's not. All right. Gary's not here. And he wasn't there either when IBM came to call. He was apparently flying his plane and didn't bother meeting IBM when they sent their folks to see if they could license his operating system. He just wasn't there. So they called Bill Gates, and they said, "Do you have an operating system?" And he didn't even have one, and said, I do. And so if, old Bill hadn't been out there flying on his plane, or Gary, whatever his name was, Gary Kildall, I say whatever his name was because we all know the name of the second person, and most of us don't remember the name of Gary Kildall, although I'm sure he's a happy fellow, and so on and so forth. But that stroke of luck for Bill Gates, no matter how smart he is, and I'm sure he is, and able, and he's obviously both smart and able, the chances that he would have become the richest man in the world would have been substantially diminished had not Gary been out there flying on his plane. So luck is pretty important. So I became a mathematician, and that was all I wanted to do when I was even a little kid. I always wanted to do mathematics, whatever exactly that was. I like to think about mathematics. And I went to MIT and discovered I could think about it okay. And I was a mathematician for 15 years, an active academic mathematician doing the things that mathematicians do, proving theorems and writing papers and occasionally giving talks. Now, I had some very good luck, even as a mathematician. I usually think, well, science, there's not much luck involved. But of course there is. Fleming invented, discovered penicillin, and I think that was probably largely luck, although he tried a lot of things and something worked. But I had luck as a mathematician. For one thing, I was lucky enough to collaborate with a fellow who was much more famous than I, named Chern, and it wasn't altogether luck, because I went to Chern. I needed some help and thought he could be helpful, and he was, and we did some good work together. But what really happened was this. I became very famous, but I had very little to do with it, because it turned out that these things that we invented, these Chern-Simons invariants, had their real application to physics, about which I knew nothing, and still am pretty much a virgin in that department. So, people say, well, what does it apply to? I say, why, quantum field theory and string theory and all that. And it really does. I mean, it's full of it. Except I don't really know what string theory is, and I certainly don't know what quantum field theory is, except in the most vague, general, and undoubtedly inaccurate manner. So sometimes you do something one place, and it ends up being very effective somewhere else. So even in the subject of science, luck can play a great role. Well, at a certain point, this talk is a lot about luck, but there'll be a few other things. So at a certain point, an investment I had made years earlier paid off. My father was certain it never would, but it did. And we gave this money. I was with a few other fellows, and we decided, they asked me if I would manage the money. I don't know why. I had absolutely no knowledge or skill at the subject. But I said I would because I knew a fellow named Charlie, and Charlie was a mathematician turned commodity trader. And I had a lot of confidence in mathematicians, and I said, Charlie's the man for us. So I went and I negotiated a deal with Charlie. He was going to manage this money for us. It was $600,000, and this was in 1974. We had $600,000, and I went up to the North End where Charlie lived in Boston and sat in his apartment, and we negotiated a deal. I had never negotiated any such deal, but it came out okay. We said Charlie would get 25% of the profits, and if we lost a lot of money, he'd have to stop. I don't remember what that was. We were going to give him a 2-year run. Actually, it was a pretty well-constructed thing. But just before I left, I said, oh, and if you make a lot of money, we have to stop. And he said, well, how much is a lot? I said, well, if you multiply our money by a factor of 10 after fees, then you got to stop. I was an optimist. And we stopped on that latter basis about 7 months after we started. Now, now, you can imagine how much luck was involved in what old Charlie did. Proof of it is, he really never made any money at commodities trading thereafter, and that was 35 years later. Charlie is still trying to figure out what it was that happened to him then. Of course, you know, I just figured, well, Charlie was smart, and I knew it, and gosh. But we, for example, had, I think, half of the open interest in sugar at one point. This, you know what sugar is. I don't know how many, probably most of you know what open interest is too. And the sugar market went from a nickel to 60 cents in a relatively short time. And we got on at 20 cents and off at 35 or 40 or whatever it was, pretty, not 60, just because we had this stopping rule and Charlie had to stop. And then it soared on to 80, to 60, and I have no doubt we would still be holding sugar today if. And then, of course, it collapsed. It just totally collapsed within weeks of when we got out, because that's the way these markets can be. I actually know the guy. I know a guy. He's a wonderful fellow, though unfortunately he was a wonderful fellow. He's no longer with us. And he was the biggest sugar grower in the Dominican Republic, which grew a lot of sugar and still does. And he had sold half his crop relatively early on forward. And then he decided he felt this market going, and he was going to just hold on and hold on and hold on and hold on and wait till he sold the second half. And he, not bound by any stopping rule or anything of the sort, held on to the penultimate moment. He told me he held on to one day before it went. And he sold the whole damn thing to General Foods or General Mills or something, started with a General anyway, and someone in the food business. And they bought the whole crop, which was enormous because they were the largest producer in the Dominican Republic, and it was a lot of sugar. But it wasn't sweet for the fellow who bought it because the market immediately plummeted, and he apparently lost his job, and so on and so forth. But my friend Philip did it exceptionally well. So that was sugar. Well, that part of the sugar thing enriched me considerably. And after 15 years, I decided to change careers in the mid-'70s. I was getting kind of bored with, well, frustrated really with mathematics and gee, how this money from sugar. And so I decided to try my hand at speculation, and I thought I would be pretty good at it. And I wasn't bad, fundamental speculation. But I brought in a partner. I used to be a code cracker. I'd spent 4 years as a code cracker. And I looked at these graphs and looked at this stuff and said, some of this, you ought to be able to model some of this stuff. So I managed to bring in the world's greatest cryptanalyst. Now, this fellow really was. He was an outstanding guy in the United States, famous with our allies, of whom there were very few. Other people didn't know his work. But Lenny was really great, and Lenny agreed to I don't know if any of you out there have ever heard of the EM algorithm. Did you ever hear of the EM algorithm? Anyone raise his hand if you know the EM algorithm? Look at all those hands go up. Well, the EM algorithm was invented by Lenny Baum and Lloyd Welsh in 64, 65 in the code cracking outfit, the Institute for Defense Analyses down in Princeton. They applied it to probabilistic functions of Markov processes, and it was very successful, and they published some papers before the National Security Agency realized what they were doing. And then they were upset for years that those papers were published. But in any event, Lenny came to work for me, and we were going to make some models of currencies, in particular currencies, which is what I like to trade. And we did. We made some interesting models. They were very good. Currencies trended in those days, and I suppose still do to some extent or other. And in those days, things trended more because it was a long time ago. And in fact, based on those graphs of the outcomes, the simulations, I trotted around and raised quite a lot of money amongst my friends. I carried this scroll. I mean, I had this long roll of paper. And I roll it out. You see, look, you start here, and you'll make all this money. And and they all believed it. They all believed it. And but the funny thing is, we never really got to put that particular model into effect because we were working away, we had computers. I was fundamental training while Lenny was theoretically working on this model and getting it in ship shape with our program. But then one day Lenny, he didn't show up for work, and he was usually a pretty regular guy. So where is Lenny? Now, Lenny came in around 1 o'clock, just after lunch, and I said, Lenny, where you been? He says, well, I'm tired of doing R, and I decided it's time to do some P. Now, I don't think I get many hands if I asked who knows what R and P are, because those are things that the National Security Agency says. See, R means research. Everything is coded to national security. So R means research and P means production. Production is when you actually read the guy's code, whereas research is when you try to figure out what it's saying. So I said, what are you talking about, production? He says, well, Margaret Thatcher has been sitting on the pound, holding it down, and she can't do that for very much longer, and we should just buy pounds. We're going to make a lot of money. And I said, Lenny, I'm sorry you didn't come in about 3 hours ago because Margaret Thatcher just stood up. He says, what do you mean? What do you mean? I said, well, she stood up. She's no longer sitting on the pound, and she's holding it down. And he said, well, how much did it go up? I said, well, a nickel. Went up a nickel, which was true. And he said, well, that's nothing, that's going to go through the roof. We better buy it. And he was so persuasive. I said, okay. I bought some pounds. It indeed went through the roof. And Lenny never looked at a model again. He had the least interest in looking at a model. Just didn't give a damn about it because he figured he could dope out Margaret Thatcher and the other world leaders better than anyone. And you know what? He did a pretty good job at it, as a matter of fact. So we kind of gave up modeling altogether. And Lenny and I together then went into the doping out the Margaret Thatchers of the world business, and it wasn't bad. And we, in the first 2 years of our association, we multiplied our investors' capital by 12, and that was after fees. Now it wasn't as good as 10 after fees in 8 months, but it was pretty damn good. And we, just like Charlie, we thought we were geniuses. But later we realized, all you had to do was be short the dollar, which is all we did. And in the late 70s, 78, 79, 80, the dollar was going straight down. And it barely ever even paused. I mean, it wasn't like, it hardly gave you any heartburn the way that dollar went down. So we just wrote it down and wrote it down and wrote it down. And again, probably if I hadn't pulled some kind of plug, we'd still be writing it down, which today might not be a bad thing to do, but there were a lot of ups and downs in the 25 or 30 years intervening. So we did swell, but I still wanted to make a model. I still thought there was a model to be made here somehow. And, but before I did that, I'll just tell you about common sense. So one of Lenny's positions was long gold. Now this was, I think, around, well, I know when it was. So I have it written down. That's how I know. January 79, gold oak started at $220 an ounce, and by January of 80, it reached $850 an ounce. So that's one of those bubbles, right? I mean, it was a real bubble, and everyone was buying gold, and Lenny was buying gold, and the gold went up and up and up all during that year, and we had we each had each of us had his own portfolio. So when it got to 500, I said, Lenny, that's pretty high. I think you should sell the gold. And, oh, no, he said, you never know how high something can go. I said, okay, well. Anyway, I took my gold off, and he kept riding his. And every few weeks I'd say, Lenny, you ought to take the gold off. You never know how high, it's high enough. And he would tell me, no, you never know how high gold can go. Okay. He generalized that to anything. You never know how, well, which is true. I mean, it wasn't necessarily productive, but it was true. But those days it was productive. And one day I came into the office, and I was talking to my stockbroker. I had a friend who was a stockbroker. I considered him my broker. And he didn't work for Bear Stearns. Actually, it was a small firm. But anyway, he was a good guy. And we were chatting, and he said, he said, this morning my wife, Lucy, cleaned out all of my old cufflinks and tie clasps in my drawers and went to sell them. I said, she did? Are things that bad? She says, no, no, no. I didn't think things were bad with Dick. His name was Dick. No, he says, you know, she's a jeweler, and she only has to stand in the short line. And I said, what are you talking about? He said, well, don't you know that people are standing in line for hours trying to sell their gold? I said, no, I didn't know that. She says, and sure, and as a jeweler, there's a short line that's especially for jewelers. I said, you've got to be kidding. People are really doing that? He said, yeah. I said, thanks. Oh, so, big piece of analysis. If people... So, here was all my analysis. See, gee, if they're waiting in line for hours and hours to sell something, maybe I should get in that line too, because how long can these prices keep going up? So I picked up the phone, I dialed the broker. In those days, I had one button, you know. In fact, all I had to do was pick up the receiver. And, hello? He was on there. See, great technology. And there were no screens, but there were phones. So I picked it up. I held the phone to Lenny's ear, and I said, tell him you're selling. He says, no, this was about $825. I said, no. He said, no, I can't do that. I said, look, I'm the boss, which I was. He'd forgotten that. And I said, I'm the boss. You got to sell. He said, all right. So he sold. He sold all the gold. The market was enormously liquid. We didn't have that much gold, and it was gone. Period. Punto. Was he mad? He was really mad. And the next day, it was up another quarter. It was up another $25 the next day. He came in. And he was furious at me. But the day after that, it was 600 and something. And that was the end of the gold rally. So if I hadn't been talking to Dick Feller, I'd still be owning that gold. So that was certainly lucky. But there was I was totally lucky, right? But there was a certain aspect of common sense that if everyone in the world is trying to sell something at the same time, if you can't get in front of them, get as near as you can and get rid of that stuff. So but around that time, I really wanted to get back to mathematics and try to make some models that would work, because I didn't think we could go through such tumult forever, successful as we may have been. So I brought in a guy named Jim Axe, a very famous mathematician. He won the Cole Prize. Nobody out there knows what the Cole Prize is. Well, maybe someone does. But anyway, it's a good prize. And, I mean, it's a really good prize. Axe was a very smart guy. And he was getting more interested in non-mathematical things. So I said, you want to come work for us? And he did. And he took the same sort of technology, if you'll excuse the expression, that we had used for currencies, and he said, you know, boys, this applies to everything. All commodities have the same kind of patterns. We can make money trading all commodities. And I said, fine. That was good. And we started a little fund and a little activity inside that with that idea, and it got better and better. We kept on fundamental trading, and finally, by the late 80s, 88 in fact, we just decided the math was the best, systematic trading was best, the fundamental trading was giving me ulcers. I've told you about some great outcomes, but believe me, they weren't all so great. Sometimes it went up, sometimes it went down. And I gradually came to realize that I knew how to manage scientists. I knew what scientists looked like, and I knew what good science was. We had hired traders in and out. Some came, some left. Some people could manage a stable of traders and do very well, but I wasn't one of them. I didn't know who was good and who wasn't good, who could tell. You needed so many years of statistical analysis, you could lose a fortune in the meantime with these guys. So, but science I understood, and I decided to just focus on making models and hiring scientists. So we inaugurated the Medallion Fund in 1988 with $25 million, and it was just all futures, currencies, commodities, and so on, no stocks, and it was all math. No overrides, no nothing. And a few years later, well, actually almost around that time, we began to research equities. How do you trade stocks We didn't know. And it took us a long time to figure it out. It took about 6 years to learn how to trade stocks, do statistical arbitrage, as people call it. That was very difficult for us, but we put a lot of effort into it. And in '93, after 5 years, we closed that fund, about 4.5, whatever it was. We closed that fund in the middle of '93 to any new investment from outsiders because we didn't know how much we could manage. At that time, it was $270 million. And we didn't know what the capacity was of these high-speed methods that we were using, and they were pretty high speed. And in fact, we were even getting higher speed. So we closed it. We figured, okay, we'll see. We made some models and decided, well, we could maybe manage twice what we had. The trick was understanding transaction costs. And when you're doing fast trading or any kind of trading, you really ought to know what your costs are. If you're doing any business, you ought to know what your costs are. And we began to model those costs pretty well. So we ran that, and we ran that without taking in any new capital. And by the end of '02, which is 9 years later, I guess, by the end of '02, it had reached almost $7 billion, that fund. And then we knew we had too much money. Then we could model everything, and we knew that $7 billion was absolutely more than we needed. We were only earning an interest rate return on the excess $2 billion, and even $5 billion was probably more than we needed. But in any event, so we started giving money back. We returned money to investors at the end of '02. We brought the fund down to $5.3 billion, and we kept it there until the end of '05. And returned all the money back to outsiders. So then the fund was owned just by the employees. Now, when you're faced with a limit, then you begin to wonder, well, what else can you do? I mean, we understood the limitation of very high-speed trading techniques. And it's obvious, right? I mean, you push these markets around, there's only so much you can trade in a finite amount of time. And if you're only looking to predict out a few days or something, or a week or a few weeks or whatever it is, a very short period, there's absolutely a limit to how much money one can earn via that prediction. You have to get the position on, you have to get the position off, and so on. All of that's very costly. So we started wondering, well, is there some really long-term, very slow trading predictions that we could begin to model? And so we set up a little group to explore that, and it was really very different from what we'd done before. You had to look at other kinds of factors besides, intraday fluctuations or price fluctuations or whatever the heck one might use for fast signals. You needed to look at balance sheets and income statements and things of that nature. But nonetheless, we began some research in this in early '04, and we had something by the end of that year, and we started trading it in-house, and we launched a fund in July of '05, which is called REEF, Renaissance Institutional Equities Fund. So that's meant to exploit the long end of the spectrum, whereas the long end of the frequency spectrum, the slow end, as opposed to Medallion, which exploits the short end. And we made a big announcement. We're starting this fund. It can manage $100 billion. And that attracted a great deal of attention, which I intended it to, because you're going to market something. We'd never sold anything. One of my salesmen is actually sitting out here somewhere. He follows me wherever I go, hoping to make a sale from some. if not just from me, maybe I'd add another $1 to the fund. We didn't have any salesmen for years. We didn't have any salesmen or marketing or any of those things that companies are supposed to have because we didn't have anything to sell. But now we had something to sell, so we did all our simulations at $100 billion, figuring, well, that's a lot. Maybe we could aspire to that. And I wanted the simulations to show, at least on paper, that we really could manage $100 billion. Anyway, we announced this $100 billion fund. And a lot of the press interpreted that to mean we were instantly going to have $100 billion. Who was going to give us that amount was quite up in the air. But of course, the intention was to grow it slowly, and if we could, and work our way along, which we've been doing. So we started that fund. It's grown very nicely. keep doing research on it to make it better. And so, so far it's been a fine success, and with a little good luck, it'll probably continue. So what are we? What do I think is a good way to operate? How do we operate? We're about 300 people today. I think half of them are salesmen. No, not really, but it just feels that way sometimes. No, I love having the salesmen around. They are a lot of fun. There's no question about it. A lot of fun. The head of the sales group says, and they're much better looking than the people who, yeah. I don't know if that's true. I don't know. It might be. It might be true. They might be better looking. But we have 300 people. Most of them are on our campus out in Long Island, which is next to Stony Brook. I mean, the campus is next to Stony Brook. We have about 200 people out there and 100 people in New York. And the people out there are doing all the operational stuff, the research groups and the production, running the computers and database and all the rest. So all the technical guys are out there, and there's a trading desk out there too. So all the operations, the business operations are conducted there. And back in New York, we have the usual. Aside from our handsome and beautiful salespeople, we have lawyers and accountants and all that kind of stuff. What we do is 100% automated. It isn't largely automated. It isn't that we use models for guidance. It isn't that the models tell the traders what they might do and then they make their choice. Nothing like that at all. It is as automated can be. The computer does its thing. It generates the trades. They typically go down, just over the wires to networks, but sometimes certain orders have to be done by phone. But there's no slippage at all in this process. The computer generates the trades, and they get executed. And every step of that way is automated. No one sticks his head in the door and says, God, you shouldn't be buying IBM. I know something bad. They're going to announce something terrible tomorrow. So even if he knew it, he wouldn't dare say it. He wouldn't say it because we wouldn't pay the least attention to him. Because, why is it? Not because we think this mythical person might not even have that information, but because it's just inconsistent with the way we couldn't model that. We couldn't model whose uncle tipped him off to something 3 years ago, and we simulate what happened then, or how one might have been feeling about the market or anything else. We couldn't model that. We couldn't simulate it, so we just don't allow it to happen. Now, of course, if something breaks or if the software breaks, someone notices that, we hope, and does something to fix it. And there may be rare occasions on the outbreak of a war that we'd scale things back. But basically, it is as automated can be. We hire really first-class scientists. I came into the business with a knowledge, because I had a career in science for quite a while, so I knew who was good and who wasn't. I could make those judgments, and the people that we brought in could make those judgments. So we really do hire people, in particular for research, but all of the technical stuff, who actually are really good by university-type standards, by good university-type standards. And our atmosphere is 100% open. We don't have any group working in a corner. We don't have any secret system that these guys have, that the other guys don't have, but nothing like that. Everything is completely open, and that's the best way to do science. Everyone communicates with everybody, weekly meetings, display whatever people have been doing, and whether it's ready for airtime or to change the system. And that's whether it's the long-term system or the short-term system or futures or equities or whatever we might be trading, options. It's all completely open. And as I say, that's a great way to do things. Inside the walls, of course not outside the walls, as you'll discover during the question period. The company is very broadly owned. We have 85 of those 300 people are shareholders, and they're the only shareholders. We don't have any shareholders who aren't employees. And everyone gets paid on a reasonably rational basis. Of course, one employer says he doesn't pay his people on a rational basis, so naturally I think we do. But everyone has a legislated percentage of the profits, or everyone's bonus is a fraction based on a profits formula, across the board profits, not the profits that he or she may have contributed. Who knows what they may have. It's hard to quantify what someone contributed in a given year. It's based on what we reckon to be his or her long-term potential in the company, and that goes from the secretaries to the even the gals who clean up to me. Everyone has a formula, and that formula is reviewed once a year and perturbed a little bit, but and it's based on how everybody does. So in theory, and largely in practice, it's a pretty all for one and one for all place. It ain't perfect, but it's close to it. And a final asset that we have, that we've built over the years, because we've been at it so long, is a heck of a big proprietary library, so to speak. So, we've tried out a lot of things, we've built a lot of things, do a lot of experiments, some succeed, some fail, but it's all there. So it's all there, available for the new guy to come in and learn what the guys who went before him do. So doing research in our business is very much like doing research in any other field. You're young, you come in, you have to learn the field. You have to learn what other people did first. You don't just start off with some big theorem or some big biological result. You have to learn what the mathematicians or the biologists did before you. Look at experiments that have been done, what worked, what failed. Then you get your own ideas. You get your own ideas based on the kinds of things that other people have done. So, and you begin to think, hey, Joe tried this 3 years ago, but he didn't really realize that if you twisted it this way, you did that, then it might work. And he'll try again what Joe did with a twist, and maybe it will work. And that's the way science is done, and that's the way we work. And well, it's used a lot of mathematics, not the kind that I did that applied to string theory, but much more. Well, maybe someday string theory will apply to finance. It's not clear it applies to anything at the moment. So, but it's still pretty good stuff in some ways. But we use a lot of mathematics, of course. We hire mathematicians, we hire physicists, we hire astronomers, we hire computer scientists for the research. We hire people who have worked broadly in quantitative science. And typically they know nothing about finance, but people can learn. Many of you did not go to business school. Many of you did, I'm sure, or whatever, but a lot of folks in this organization studied some scientific discipline or another, and then later learned finance. And that's been our approach. So we haven't hired out of Wall Street at all. So we use a lot of mathematics. We try to use common sense. And career-wise, I have to say, I don't think anyone in the world's had better luck than I have. So there's my talk, and I'm open for questions, if you got any. Well, I don't see a single hand. Oh, he's rushing. Okay.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. It was very educational. You talk about 100% automation, but how often is the model changed? You talk about that.
Yeah. The model changes weekly. Weekly. 1, 2, 3 changes are made every week, probably. So the model is constantly being improved. The models. So in that sense, it's not automated. But that does that answer your question? Here's another question.
Hi, could you give us the details of one model which used to work and doesn't work anymore, and you're happy to give us the details of that model?
Now, you said, could I? And the answer to that question is certainly. Now, would I is another question altogether. But well, yeah, you say it doesn't work anymore, but you never know about these things. They could always come back. You know, this is an example of a phenomena which I think everyone knows has lost its zip, but probably hasn't disappeared forever. Is plain simple trending, as I alluded to in the first place. You know, if you looked in the 50s and 60s at commodities prices, you would have looked like it was just a giveaway. I mean, these things were just, you know, or down, down, down. So you could make a lot of money just by trend following. And there's a good reason that commodities and, you know, and physical goods would have a tendency to trend, because in the absence of speculators, should such an amazing world ever come back, but in the absence of speculators, things will trend because the market gets cleared every day, and if there's a shortage developing, well, people will come in and bid the price up a little bit each day. These shortages don't suddenly manifest themselves, they accrete. I mean, there's a little less wheat each day, a little less wheat, there's a little more drought, there's a little more this. In the absence of speculation, consumed goods of that, you know, commodities will trend. Now, speculators come in and they they try to jump on the trends, which has the effect of killing them or hurting them. So, over time, trend following went from being a terrific business to being a so-so business to being a, well, maybe you should do it if you can't think of anything else to do, business. So there's an example of a kind of predictive signal which has simply eroded. But almost anyone you come up with, almost any good, viable, statistically significant predictive signal will, with almost certainty, erode over the next several years. It may have a half-life of 5 years. That's not a bad guess. It might be 10 if you're very lucky. We found one signal in the late 80s which never seems to have eroded, but it'll go eventually. So you have to keep refreshing, you have to keep coming up with more things because the market is working against you. It's just like any other business. If you don't keep getting better, you're going to do worse because your competitors are going to push you back. So this year's car model has to be better than last year's car model. This year's hat has to be better than last year's hat, or whatever it is you're making. And in this case, we're making what we're making, and we have to keep doing it better. Next question. Yes.
With the $100 billion you're considering possibly thinking about raising, at what point do you control the market, and at what point do you decide that maybe this is too much money just for U.S. equities, which you're doing, and expand into, say, overseas equities or what have you?
Well, you know, as I said, the $100 billion was a template for research. I figured if we couldn't manage, this is a fund. I didn't mention that our medallion fund charged humongous fees, and then that was okay because we did very well. A fund, this $100 billion fund could not charge humongous fees. It could only charge low fees. At least that was my feeling, and that's, you know, so in order to make it worthwhile, you had to imagine it was going to be very big. Otherwise, it didn't make a heck of a lot of sense. So the $100 billion was a research template, a goal, perhaps. But we take it 1 month at a time. I don't know if we can actually manage the $100 billion. We're a quarter of the way there, roughly. I think 26 or 20, maybe 26 billion, something like that in that fund. It's doing fine. We keep making it better. But the day may come well before 100 billion where we just figure, and we can quantify it pretty well, but we're not keeping up. The research isn't going fast enough to give us the oomph that we need to be at 100 billion, so maybe we would stop at 50. I don't know. But I'm pretty optimistic because the research is going well. We are making improvements constantly or frequently. And so I'm hopeful that when we get, that we'll be able to do that. But one does, you just don't know. There's a hand back there. I'll get you next.
Are there some styles or themes of investing that stand out in your mind as being particularly appropriate for your mathematical modeling? For instance, I use a modified version of Graham and Dodd in my work, and I was wondering what, if anything, opinion you might have on Graham and Dodd or other forms of investing from your standpoint as a mathematical modeler.
Well, Graham and Dodd looked at balance sheets. They liked companies that actually sold for less than their book value, and I think that's a fine approach to buy companies that sell for less than their book value. But there are only 4 such companies. Well, there might be a few more, but looking at things like book value and cash flow and the kind of fundamental things that Graham and Dodd felt were important, certainly grist for this reef fund mill. They're slow changing things, cash flows or PE ratios or book value, all those things that appear in balance sheets and income statements are appropriate to try to model. I don't, in our work, we don't discover some killer thing which by itself is probably can't even overcome transaction costs. The things that we do are many, many, many little things. A little thing here, a little thing there. Each one gives you an additional edge. Pile a few together, you might be able to overcome transaction costs. Once you can, it's like any business. Once you can cover your fixed costs, then a lot of things are incremental, and you're in good business. But first, you have to cover your fixed costs. And none of the individual signals that we have that comprise our models are enough to cover the fixed costs. So the Graham-Dodd kind of things, those are great, and some of them might pan out. But none of them is going to be so dispositive that in order to determine that it works, you really have to test it on a lot of stocks, all of them, thousands, for as many years as you can, and you may well get some statistical significance of, something that comes out of, wasn't there a Coddle? Isn't there a third guy in that book? Whatever happened to Coddle? Say it again? I see. He was just an apprentice, so it's safe to forget his name. I'm sure he didn't feel that way at the time. That was the version I read, with old Coddle there. Oh, wait a minute, this fellow here.
Jim, what's the process you go through when you decide to sell?
When I decide to sell,
What's the thinking process?
exactly the same process as when we decide to buy. It's the same analysis. If you predict it's going down, it's time to sell it. If you predict it's going up, it's probably time to buy it. The predictions are symmetric, more or less. These kinds of systems, for example, Reef holds 3,000 to 4,000 positions. It's touching half its positions every day, so it's constantly making little perturbations. If you had a good prediction for a stock and you long it, and then your prediction weakens a little bit, even though it's still positive, you might sell a little bit because on a risk-adjusted basis, you have a little too much for that kind of, for that size expectation and so on. So, does that answer your question?
I mean, is there any human interaction between?
No, none whatever. No one asks for permission to sell or permission to buy. The computer does it, and that's the end of it. Yeah.
So we usually refer luck as something that unexpected to repeat in the future, and skill to be something that's supposed to be persistent. And therefore, we're trying to focus energy on something that's skillful and hopefully give us an edge in the future. Is it a way to scientifically differentiate luck from skill from your funds? Because if you data mine too much, obviously you pick up a lot of noises and probably result in bad performance in future. But we have to do it to a certain extent as a quant. So is there any advice for that?
Well, first of all, there's nothing wrong with data mining as long as you know what you're doing. If you make if you make a million tries and you find something that's probability 1 in a trillion, you think you're onto something, right? It's a question of what the statistical every experiment you do, whether it's a data mining experiment or sticking your finger in the air and trying one thing, needs to have associated with it a significance measure, so you can tell. So
when you data mine it, the usual statistical significance no longer applies, right?
The usual statistical significance what?
No longer applies because you're exposed selecting something that has a high realization, right? So is it something that's more sophisticated and the standard statistical theory that to help us to sort of differentiate it better?
Well, we have approaches to that question, which return statistical significance to what we to these things. So I think some reasonably sophisticated statistical stuff would deal with that question.
I'm actually curious as to what pieces. I'm over here.
Oh, okay.
As to what pieces of financial dogma you actually found to be very useful and which ones you didn't.
Well, we've definitely found buy low and sell high to be useful. That's one of the ones that we found to be useful. You know, a lot of our work is testing out financial dogma. So if I told you which are good and which are bad, I'd give away half the stuff we do. But any piece of dogma is probably worth testing, I can tell you that. But we've tested. When I had a child some years ago, I walked into I was a good father, and I went to the procedure. And the head nurse said, "Wow, it's really crowded." I said, "Yes, I noticed a lot of." She says, "It's always this way in the full moon." I said, "It's always this way in the full moon? You mean you have more?" "Oh, everybody knows. She was pretty old. I mean, you know, wasn't as old as I am, but she'd been around, right?" She said, "Oh, yeah, everybody knows. There's more babies born in the full moon. It's always this way in the maternity ward." I couldn't wait to test that. I mean, you really has something. This would be really interesting if there was more. It would only be, you know, I would be the only serious person who knew this. But it turned out no serious person knows it because it isn't true. So, but still, it was a great thing to test. I have tested sunspots. There was a time we tested the frequency of sunspots. Does that make the markets go up and down? That's a little tricky because they only come, 11 years or something like that. So you don't have a lot of data to worry about sunspots. But after all, the full moon comes every 4 weeks, so you can. So we test a lot of things. Some of them look good. You think they'd be good, and they're lousy. Some of them you think will be good and are good. And some of them, you don't know why they're good, but they're good. That's it would be great if every, especially in the high-speed trading, I would say, there are certain things that just work. Like that signal I talked about, that has worked ever since we started, has never degraded. I damned if I know why that works. So sometimes you can figure things out, and sometimes you can't. But if the statistics are there, you have to go with it. So, next.
What information can you share about how you view transaction costs? Are commissions still a factor?
Where's the question? Raise your hand. I can't see who's.
Back here, the question was, what can you share about TCA, transaction cost analysis? Are commissions still a factor? Is liquidity more important?
Well, commissions are a factor as long as they're charging them. Now, we've tried to persuade Bear Stearns to give up that archaic practice. But anything you have to pay is a factor, I assure you. Commissions and ticket charges and slippage and every other goddamn thing is a factor. You got to pile them all together. And so obviously commissions, I'll be a little more serious. Commissions have come down a great deal over the years, so they're less of a factor than they might have been 20 years ago. Certainly when there were fixed commissions, I think they charged $1 a share or something. It was very expensive to trade, and they encouraged you to do it with great frequency. But I guess it wasn't $1 a share, but it was remarkably high, remarkably high. Next question.
I just have a question over here.
Okay, that's fine. I'm not gonna point anymore. I'll let the.
I was just wondering if you could share your thoughts on some of the large investment banks either buying majority interests or partial ownerships in the large hedge funds recently, and what you think the impact is going to be on alternative investments.
That's a good question, but I still don't see who asked it. Oh, there she is. Okay. Well, I think it's quite interesting. I applaud these big investment banks buying pieces of hedge funds. Maybe they'll buy a piece of ours. Maybe they'll buy our whole hedge fund and pay me so much money I'll retire. I think it's a splendid development. You know, it was in the early 80s, there was a lot of inflation, and land was inflating. And a lot of foreigners, those foreigners, were buying good Iowa farmland, and the Iowans got very upset, and some of the other states. Oh my God, you know, they're going to price our America. We have to stop allowing farmers to bid up the price of our land. Now that was one of the dumbest decisions. I mean, the farmers loved it. I mean, the farmers said, well, good, let them bid it up. I mean, the farmers knew it was no good. They were selling them this land that didn't produce. So I think it's a great thing. Now, to what extent will it affect the industry? Probably less than people think. It'll get somewhat less innovative, I suppose, if these organizations, hedge funds, are in the hands of the bigger institutions. They tend to uniformize things a little bit. But on the other hand, it could get more professional. I don't think it's going to hurt the industry, especially. Maybe make it a little less flamboyant and interesting. I think, you know, there's a great deal of talent has left those organizations over the years to form hedge funds. I mean, every day you read about Joe Schmo has left Salomon Brothers or left Goldman or left Bear Stearns or whatever, and he's starting his hedge fund along with his team of 6 that he stole from someplace else. And because, you know, people have done that because they can make a lot of money. Obviously, the institutions, the big banks, they want these guys back in some sense or other. I mean, that's not quite the way they look at it, but they don't want to lose out on this activity, so they'll bite the bullet and buy a place, or invest in a place. I think it's just part of what's going on. No big deal.
I have a right here.
Yes.
Another question related to the industry. If quant investing proves to be superior the way you have proved, at least in the last few years, would you think that over time the market, the industry is going to evolve to quant investing? How quickly do you think it's going to happen? When you look at 10 years, will this accelerate exponentially and therefore create the demand?
I understand the question. I think there'll be more of it. I don't think quantitative investing is going to supplant the other end of the spectrum. I think, you know, what we do is what I call, it's like extensive agriculture. We grow things, farmers can grow things on a very, very large scale. They do not pay attention to every stalk of wheat. There may be little corners of the field that are rat infested. It doesn't bother them too much. You know, they have their costs. They keep their costs down. They raise all this grain. They keep the number of employees down, and they can make a good living. Now, you know, that's exactly the opposite from intensive agriculture, where you grow, you know, 2 acres of, well, I was going to say marijuana, but something that, something that's a high price crop, you know, and you want to watch every, you know, coffee, for example, is a pretty high price. You want to watch every plant. You're still laughing about the marijuana. I mean, but okay. So intensive agriculture is just the opposite. Every plant is important, you know, and that's fine because each of those plants you can do well on. So we're at one end of the spectrum. This highly automated quantitative stuff. Now, quantitative stuff in general is not so highly automated as what we do. And there's no doubt that quantitative stuff, and in all your companies, you know, and most of you are quants anyway, you know, more and more people are being drawn into that. There's a lot to be quantified. There's a lot to be studied in the financial industry that requires this kind of analysis. And in a way, it's going to be quite pervasive, but it certainly is not going to mean that everyone's going to invest like we do. The Warren Buffetts of the world are not going to be deterred because they're not looking for millions of chances a day. They're looking for 1 or 2 really good ones. And if you know how to do that, you're going to do just fine, as I'm sure Mr. Buffett would assert. So there are a number of ways to skin a cat, but the quantification in general is certainly going to take over and become pervasive in this industry, and I think that's all to the good.
Hi, Manish Arora with your Capital, and I'm wondering what percentage of your work you have an economic intuition on, and what percentages, as you said, who knows why it makes money, but it seems to do anyway.
Well, that's a good question. The second part, the way you asked it, there couldn't be intuition. He said, well, the other part, kind of intuition as to who knows why. Well, that's not intuition. That's a conclusion that you might draw. But there is such intuition, and that is because that approach worked before in some other part of the business. Why shouldn't it work this time? You might not know why it worked before. You might be, but there's a reasonable chance that a certain way of putting data together that worked, let's say, for stocks might work for equities, or if it worked for gold, it might work for wheat or whatever, even though you didn't really know why that thing worked in the first place. So that's an intuition that comes out of the science, but not out of the field itself, rather than out of the fundamentals. But certainly, you'd like to know why, and I think in our own business, it would be good if we develop more of that first intuition. We're learning and maybe bring in some people who have a better knowledge of finance than we do, who have some real experience in that sort of thing, who can give us some advice as to what might be important and what. But you read a lot, you read the literature, you play around, you get some feeling. But both kinds of intuition are important. Next question. Well, you got it. Okay.
What would it take to let me look at your proprietary library?
What would it take? Well, what are you offering?
If I'm not my cut bet, I'll let you start the working group after I'm done reading.
I see. No, even that. No, I think I don't think you'd want to do that. I don't think we'd want to do that, but it's a good try. Next. You got to get a mic. See, that's what. Here's a fellow who wants to give you a mic.
Hi. You were saying earlier your fund is as automated as you can possibly get. I'm right over here. How is it positioned to react to sudden changes that you can really, that are really impossible to quantify, or like 9/11 attack or an earthquake?
Yeah. Well, those kinds of things. See, almost everything that happens every day is impossible to quantify. A president of a company dies or some new drug is discovered. There's a million little things, none of which the individual acts could be quantified. All you can do is predict how many presidents are likely to die of companies each day or something like that. So when you have a major earthquake, of course it's not prepared to react to that. So with 9/11, we would have, because put on reduced positions just to reduce volatility. We would have done that probably after 9/11. However, the market simply didn't open, as you recall. At least the stock market didn't open. We may have reduced some positions in the futures, anything would open, but pretty much all markets were frozen after 9/11. Our positions tend to be very balanced, so we didn't make or lose money during 9/11. It didn't matter very much to us in that respect. You try to reduce volatility. That's all you can do, because what you're really saying is an event has happened that's going to tremendously increase volatility, or possibly tremendously. So, and the computer can't know that, because any computer is going to estimate volatility by history, maybe some combination of short-term, long-term, or whatever's programmed into it. An earthquake in Tokyo is not going to be part of it. And then you'd have to make a judgment, how much vol is there going to be, and how much should you scale down, and can you scale down? So those are issues. But there's nothing special about what we do, because anyone who's holding a portfolio, whether it's fundamentally driven or however it's driven, has to make the same decision when and if that major earthquake hits, right? So in those cases, it's pretty classical. We have some knobs that we can turn that will reduce vol, that will start a selling program to get stuff out, but at times like that, 9/11, for example, you couldn't sell anyway because nothing was open. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your insightful and inspiring talk. 2 quick questions, please. You say that the Medallion Fund is more of a high-frequency, short-term trading fund, and the REIF is more long-term.
Yeah.
Are we to imply therefrom that the futures markets are more geared towards short-term strategies and the equity markets are more geared towards long-term trading strategies from your research? And if so, are you implying...
No, I didn't understand the question, so...
The question is, you're using 2 different types of time horizons for the different funds.
Correct.
And can one rightly imply from that the dynamics in the futures markets are different from that in the equity markets?
No, because this cuts across equities and futures. No.
Okay.
Medallion has a lot of equities in it today. Medallion is equities and futures. What distinguishes Medallion is that it's high speed, that it's short predictive horizons, a lot of trading. What distinguishes REIF is that it's a very long predictive horizon and consequently very little trading, relatively speaking. Okay. So, but there's no difference between the fields.
As a follow-on to that, do you find that you have different models for different market complexes and also different models for individual markets in the complexes? Say, for instance, in the futures markets, do you have a different set of signals for currencies from indices or large cap versus small?
Yeah, that's too. I don't want to answer that question. I don't want to answer that question.
Over here. Okay. To what degree do you take a top-down economic approach into the models? For example, you talked about the dollar trending down in the late 70s, which culminated around 84 with the Plaza Accord agreement when they devalued. To what degree do you say China's raising rates, the ECB's raising rates, Britain's raising rates, we're stable here to potentially going down, the dollar's already been beaten up, it's probably only going lower. So to what degree does that enter into your thoughts?
Only to the extent that our models predict the dollars going down or up, or that interest rates are flattening. You know, everything is, no one is sitting back there, is sitting there with that kind of global macro insight. To the extent we can predict the dollar, we can predict the dollar. To the extent that we can predict euro rates, we predict euro rates, and that's the end of it. Obviously, if you can predict the dollar, there's a fair amount. We predict the dollar all the time, and one can do a fair amount of trading in currencies. Those are big, robust markets. Similarly, if you can predict the S&P future, well, we buy and sell the S&P future. That's a pretty good market. But we don't. There's no wise man saying in this environment, blah blah blah, we should be this or we should be that. That would be not. That's just not what we do at all. I'm not saying it's a bad thing to do, but we don't do it. You gotta have a mic.
Right here.
Okay.
Dr. Simons. Could you? I'm over here.
That row is how to done. Oh, okay, back there.
Could you make some Could you make some comments about your involvement with Math for America? And is there anything that members of this professional society could do to become involved in that effort?
Well, I'll just say something very briefly because I don't think people want to hear a harangue. The Math for America is an organization that we've started here in New York that helps get teachers who know the subject into the math classrooms, high school classrooms in particular. Fewer and fewer teachers of math and science actually know math and science for the reason that so many of you potential teachers of math and science are sitting here in this room. The economy has changed. These fields are more and more valuable. People get pulled out of potential teaching. People who know this stuff. There's a lot of math and science known in this room, I can tell. So people do that instead of teach, because the teaching can't compete in terms of compensation in these fields, and we're developing programs to try to redress that. And right now, there's a bill in Congress, the America Competes bill, in which a fair amount of our program is in that bill. And so hopefully that will get passed, and that will begin to put in place a national program to embody the principles that we're trying to do here in New York. Log on to mfa.org, maybe it's mathforamerica.org, and you'd see what you can do, and we do take contributions. That would be nice. Next.
Question? Go ahead.
Yeah.
Hi. I was wondering. Sorry. Go ahead.
No. I just wanted to give her a mic for the next one. You go right ahead.
Okay. You're somewhat hesitant to answer things, so I thought I'd ask an interesting question, and you may not want to answer it. But
I may not.
What I noticed through watching someone manage money more conventionally over 30 years is that every decade has a theme.
Right.
Like the 80s had high inflation, so if you bought stocks with low fixed assets, replacement cost was going up. Not labor unions, so you didn't have COLA, cost of living adjustments. If you bought a certain class of stocks, namely advertising agencies was one example, that was sort of a certain class of stocks did very well in the 80s.
Yeah.
Then in the 90s you have the tech boom, then now we have sort of what I call, I don't know, the earth boom, or whatever you call it, the sort of the raw materials.
I think we're hearing it now, that earth boom.
Okay. And you also have a gigantic shift right now to offshore stocks, and you're making a lot more money on, I'm just sort of saying on average, probably offshore.
Yeah.
Can you get ahead of that? Those themes, are you, that's not your business?
Well, what you try to do is develop predictive schemes which would pick some of that up. But getting ahead of it the way you just talked, I would say no. For example, in the simulations of our REEF fund, during the tech bubble, there were a couple of years that we just were flat or losing while the S&P and the NASDAQ were going through the roof, because we just didn't have any signals that would capture the frenzy and the insanity that was going on in the late 90s. So that, and had we been marketing that fund at that point, we probably would have looked not so terrific. But over the subsequent couple of years, the market collapsed. We kept sailing on up, and this is a simulated thing, and did great. So you needed some patience. But certain things it will catch because they're rooted in good reason. They're rooted because maybe the earnings of some group are increasing, or the PEs are shrinking, or something that would give maybe extra value to that group. Of course, if it's shrinking, you wouldn't think they were going up at the same time. But you know what I mean. So certain general things will catch some of these waves, and others, to the extent that they're just sort of raw passion, I doubt that we would get it.
Okay. Could you just go back to, just as a follow-up to that, there was sort of a speculative boom in tech stocks, I guess you'd say. You mentioned that when the speculators come into a market, you sort of seem to say they ruin it. And I was thinking...
I didn't say that.
Well, no, I may have misheard you. Okay, back here in the trenches. But I was thinking of the real estate in the last 6 years basically tripling in the U.S.
Right.
And I could you just repeat or refine your comment, or just repeat what you're...
No, when speculators come in, they destroy trends. They don't destroy the market. They by definition, they destroy a trend. A nice stately increase is suddenly hit by a wave of speculation, and the price jumps more quickly to where it probably belongs. I think speculation is good. How could I think it's good?
It accelerates.
I'm a speculator. Huh?
It accelerates.
It accelerates. It gets you closer to the truth faster. Okay. That's what speculation does. On the other hand, that's very unfortunate for a fellow who wants to get on a ride and just keep going along and making money.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I promise I'll give up my mic to the lady when I finish my questions.
All right. That's very polite of you.
Well, when your fund was returning like 12 times in 2 or 3 years, I mean, how did you mitigate your portfolio back then? And also, you were saying something about the WIC fund when that gentleman asked you over there.
Yeah.
And is it correct that your WIC fund is the performance in your long and the short signal is symmetric?
No, the refund is net long. The refund is it's designed to be net long $1. If you put in $1, you'll be net long $1, but you'll be about $1.75 long and 75 cents short. That's what the refund is. And what was the first part of your question?
Back when you're returning about 12 times in 2-3 years, how do you mitigate the risk of your portfolio?
How do we mitigate the risk of our portfolio in the days that we were really minting a lot of money? Not as much as we should have. I'm certain of that. Seriously, we didn't understand that very well, and we were lucky enough to avoid getting killed. Now, this young lady.
Oh, I was wondering, when you say that you're 100% automated, does that improve?
Speak into the mic and say it again.
You continually said that you're 100% automated in your business practice. Does that include every process after the trade too? And have you modeled the costs of all those processes?
Give me an example of such a process.
Clearing and settling when you're in the equity market.
What was the charge for it? We put that in we model that.
But is it straight through processing in your firm?
Do you have a service that you want to provide for us?
If you modeled all this stuff, then you might have another business there. I was thinking.
We might have another bit. I knew, but this woman has something to tell me. But we should do that. I'm not actually sure what you're getting at, although maybe there is another business there. We model an awful lot of stuff. I don't think we model how maybe some of the. I mean, we should talk separately about that question because I don't think I altogether understand it. But I know you have something to say. Maybe we can take one more question and then I think we're. Well. How many people have a question? Raise your hand if you have a question. All right. Well, yeah, just raise it. Just trying to bid up the number. We'll take two more, and that's it, because I think we're out of time, right?
Hi. Since I have the mic here, so I might just. Yeah, you were talking about the research mode. You're talking about you're totally open.
Inside.
Yeah, inside. Still, I understand that's probably the most productive way. But on the other hand, how do you maintain the sense of fairness in the sense that, like, you've been working your whole life to know how to run $5 billion fund, and a young guy came in, he can just learn that in a couple of years?
Yeah, but he can't leave. He can't leave. We don't have any turnover. He can't leave.
But is that by contract or?
It's by common sense. You know, when we're very careful. Of course, people do occasionally leave. They retire and they go back and take care of their mothers. Some of them get into charitable work. We've had a few go back into science. But in only 2 cases, and they're at the wrong end of a lawsuit, have people gone to join another firm. We try very hard. When I was a code cracker, I spent 4 years doing this code breaking stuff. They had a fine method to control this process. It was called 20 to life. It's called 20 years to life, and it worked remarkably well. Very few people went to competitors. They did once in a while, but they went to competitors. So the fellow who's been working 10 years on this work and has made some progress, and a young guy comes in and he shows him how to do it better, both are going to benefit. The fellow who's been there a long time is going to make more money because the overall profits are going to go up, and the fellow who just came in is going to get a big jump in his participation, so everybody, in theory, will be happy. And in fact, they are. I mean, everybody loves it when a new young person comes in and makes a big contribution. That's just great. Okay, one last question, and I think it's that fellow.
You have given us 2 very strong reasons to believe the statement everybody knows, past results are no guarantee of future performance. One is that just everything works for a while and then it doesn't after a while. And the other is that results depend a lot on luck. We're looking right now at 9,000 hedge funds that are all trying to find alpha out there somewhere, and over 3,000 funds of funds. I wonder, do you think that the fund business has has room to grow, has got too far, and there's too much dependence on luck and unsustainable strategies? And do you also think that fund-to-fund folks can actually identify the difference between luck and skill in the funds that they're evaluating?
Well, you raise good questions. I'll get to the last one first. Can fund-to-funds? We run a fund-to-funds internally. We've done a pretty good job of identifying people. History does tell you something. It's certainly not dispositive. That doesn't put the question away. But past performance of a hedge fund is, to some extent, an indicator of how well he's going to do in the future. And, I think, the kind of analysis and judgment, due diligence, and so on that one can do in the fund-to-funds business is what one would do in any business. Past performance is certainly not a guarantee of future success. I don't think the SEC would allow you, or whoever does this, to put in past performance is somewhat lightly correlated with future performance, which I think is a true statement. So, now whether the industry is growing too big, there's too many managers, too much money, I don't know. I really don't know. I think there are a lot of bright people. There'll be some blow-ups and so on, but I really think that the average hedge fund is safer than the average stock. The volatility of hedge funds is lower than the volatility of individual stocks, by and large. Obviously not completely. So, it's an industry. We'll see what happens, but I can't prognosticate. And that, I think, must end the session. I'm getting...
I just wanted to thank Jim Simons as well, and congratulate him again for the 2006 Financial Engineer of the Year. We will be reconvening at 4 p.m. for hedge fund valuations back in this room. Thank you.